Alan Christian with Flickering Myth Gaming here. 2 weeks ago I gave my rankings for every major Metroid release. Check out that video if you haven't already. And I've spent every day since then with the latest in the series, Metroid Dread. Having been a Metroid fan for as long as I've been playing games, I can very vividly remember when I first heard the name Metroid Dread over 15 years ago. It seems kind of surreal to actually have it in my hands now and be playing it. What's even more surreal is that the game exceeded all of my expectations. Now, I haven't been building hype for 15 years. I had long reached a point where I accepted that this game no longer existed and wasn't going to come out. So it's not like my expectations were sky high. Needless to say, I certainly wasn't expecting to encounter what might be my favorite Metroid game. Now that's a statement I don't make lightly, and it is one that I make tentatively, because there is such a thing as recency bias, and I actually have to weigh that against my nostalgia for Super Metroid versus what's actually there in the gameplay. We'll get into all of that a little bit deeper here in a few minutes. On that note, I could give you a straightforward review, and I'll be doing a little bit of that up front, but the critical consensus is pretty well established, and I'd really only be heaping more praise on the game, so instead I'd like to dig a little deeper, without getting into spoiler territory, and try to assess where the game stands in the pantheon of Metroid games. And even within the Metroidvania/search action genre. Metroid fans, myself included, have been waiting for nearly 20 years to see a true sequel to Metroid Fusion, to see an actual Metroid 5, to see what we already have known for years was called Metroid Dread. Now that it's here, how does it stack up? As stated, I'll be avoiding spoilers, so don't worry about seeing any footage late game. Nothing here is past the first hour and a half. It's on my second playthrough, which is in hard mode, so if any of this looks a bit challenging, keep that in mind. I actually think talking about challenge is a good place to start. I've seen a lot of reviews and criticisms addressing the difficulty of the game. A few reviews have even denigrated the game for its challenge. Is this game, even on its default normal difficulty, a challenging game? Yes, it is. It expects you to learn patterns and timing. It expects you to take things on board. It expects you to have some form of critical thinking at points. So, yes, it's challenging. This is a good thing. Metroid games have always been challenging, and they've always presented boss fights that force you to develop a strategy. Metroid Dread expects more out of you than many previous Metroid games. However, and this is an important delineation, Metroid Dread is not a punishing game. Yes, your first playthrough, you will die over and over again as you learn the patterns and learn what not to do, but you will not be set back. You will not be forced to go all the way back to your last save. In most situations, if you die, in regular hallways to regular enemies, yes, you're going back to your regular save point. But if you die to the enemies, or if you die to a boss, you'll be taken back to right before the boss fight. Punishing and challenging are not the same things. There is no leeway here. There are no shortcuts out of learning how to fight these bosses. There are some shortcuts on the bosses, don't get me wrong, but those kind of have to be earned, and you're probably not going to achieve them on your first playthrough. Some of those shortcuts are even more difficult to pull off than fighting the bosses straight up, but they will be quicker. So this isn't a walk in the park, but don't expect like NES Castlevania or Zelda 2 or NES Ninja Gaiden levels of difficulty. If you keep trying, you'll get there. So what's the gameplay itself like? Controlling Samus has never been so fluid and never been so much fun. Doing all the slides, I even like the Shine Spark puzzles in this, and I hate Shine Spark puzzles. I think previous Metroid games kind of give you a feeling of a power fantasy of building up stronger and going in and beating ass, as where this makes you feel like an increasingly skilled surgeon. I think it's wonderful. Just an absolute blast to control. even if some aspects of the control can be a little bit complex. So moving past the action parts and into the search parts, what's the exploration like in this game? I think it's top notch. You've got 8, 7.5 areas to explore, and they're all well fleshed out, they're all well realized, and they're full of secrets, which is what you want out of a game like this. I think the map system is great. I've heard a lot of criticism about the map system, but I think this is one of the best map systems I've ever seen in a 2D Metroidvania style game. It's top tier. Yes, you could probably do with a little bit brighter colors, like to make, to see some of these doors at a glance, but you can zoom in. You can set it to highlight only one type of door or block in any given area, so if you just got a weapon and you're trying to figure out all of the places to use this weapon or ability, you can highlight that and, just go there. It also comes with markers that you can set. So if you have a place of interest that you don't think that you'll remember, just drop a marker and you'll be good to go. I think the navigation on this thing is phenomenal, and I don't understand any of the complaints in that regard. As far as the flow of the game, I'll be honest with you. There was a point in my first playthrough where I thought that it was kind of pushing me along a little too much. Like, I wanted to be a little freer to mess up and to go the wrong way, but I felt like it very intuitively pushed me in the way that I needed to be going. Now, it didn't force me, and that's the difference. It didn't force me to go along that path, but I barely had to do any thinking to just be moving in the intended progression. So I also don't understand any of the complaints where people talk about this being outdated and the conventions are old and they couldn't figure out where they were going. I thought it delineated the intended progression incredibly well. Now, the ability to sequence break in this might be second to none in this series. It's insane. Some of these sequence breaks are very clearly intentional. If you've gotten some bombs before a specific boss, you can just pretty much skip his whole second phase. Some of the ones that I've been messing with and seeing people pull off on YouTube seem a bit less intentional, and the game's very polished, don't get me wrong, but it has these little quirks that you can exploit to push yourself a little further, before you're necessarily intended to be in these certain places, and, you'll pay for that. Even with what were obviously intended exploits, you'll pay for it. You'll have to figure out how to, you'll have to use all of your other abilities if you've gotten to a place that they expected you to have, something that would have made navigation a little bit easier, like a screw attack. If you get the gravity suit before you get the screw attack, you better be good with the shine spark. Otherwise, you're just not getting out of that specific spot. Sequence breaking this thing has just been a ton of fun, and the speedrunning and sequence breaking community has just blown up in the past 2 weeks. It's insane. I don't think you can even do this kind of thing with Super Metroid. So those are the main things that I want out of a Metroid game. I want challenge, and I want good exploration, and this nails both of those incredibly well. You got the search, you got the action. Perfect package. But one other thing a lot of people expect out of a Metroid game is atmosphere. And I will say, I tend to agree with most critics that the music here, not incredibly memorable. To a lesser extent, I agree that the overall atmosphere, the world design, isn't necessarily as memorable as something like Super Metroid, but I don't necessarily agree with the assertion that everything looks the same. It most certainly does not. There's a lot of background detail in these worlds. It might not be on the foreground as much. A lot of the foreground, if that's all you're focusing on, might seem a little samey, but there's plenty of detail in the background. And, there's plenty of things to look out for. And I think the art design on this was fantastic. I have no issues with the art design here. The individual parts of the world might feel a bit segmented and a bit away from each other, which would probably fall more under the exploration part rather than the atmosphere part. But I do think that all of the biomes are pretty distinct. Yes, you'll have some lava areas outside of the actual, lava zone, but they're close to the lava zone. You have some water areas that are close to the water zone, so yes, those kind of blend together, but they're kind of intended to. They're kind of intended to fade from one to the other, even though you get on elevators and trains to go to other areas. They all kind of flow in a certain way. But I think the art design is good, and the atmosphere is very good, even if it isn't necessarily destined to be as iconic as some of the prior games. I do want to talk about the Emmys, because I haven't brought those up yet. The Emmy sections are tense. They are stressful, especially on your first playthrough. And they're not the whole game at all. They're not a huge part of the game. You actually really only, have to deal with 5 of them. There's 7 in the game, but 5 is really all you'll be confronting. And they're fun and they're interesting, and the game wouldn't be that much different without them. I think the Dread moniker doesn't just apply to the dread of dealing with these indestructible robots. It deals with, I don't want to give away some of the twists here, but I think that some of the lore and some of the stuff that you're dealing with outside of the Emmys can be a little dreadful. A lot of that picks up on some of the stuff that was dealt with in Fusion. I will say, my one gripe with this game is that you do get a mutated version of an early boss from this game, but it's not the mutated version of the early boss that I would have wanted. That classic boss had been brought back a second time in this game. The way the other early boss was brought back. That would have been perfection. So how does this game stack up to other Metroid games for me? It's right near the top. I'll have to let time do its thing, and I'll have to revisit Metroid 2 and Super Metroid again, just to get a better feel of where exactly this one falls. But I wouldn't be surprised if I walked away feeling like this is the best one. Let me know your thoughts on Metroid Dread and the aspects of it I presented here, and we'll talk about it in the comments down below. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.